So today, we kick off a brand new series titled Sex, Money, and Power. It's going to be a non-controversial, laid-back series, I'm sure. And while I love this title, Sex, Money, and Power, I really feel like if I could name it something else, I would name it after the inspiring words of Julie Andrews in her classic, The Sound of Music. A few of my favorite things. That's what I would call this series. Sex, money, and power. The three things everybody thinks about, but nobody wants to talk about. And you might be asking this question, why are we talking about sex, money, and power in church? And it's because of this. We're convinced that we can either be shaped by the language and the conversation that culture is having, or we can be formed by the teachings and the way of Jesus. We really do believe this, that where the culture is loud, the church should be clear. And so this series, just so you know, is not a series of a list of do's and don'ts. It's not a series where we're going to guilt you or shame you in any way, shape, or form about kind of where you are in your journey with God or where you are in these particular areas. It's really a series that's designed to do something different. This series invites us to consider how much better life would be if we agreed with God about His purpose and plan. And if we're honest, this is a question that every single one of us is going to have to wrestle to the ground at some point in our life. The question that we'll have to deal with, whether or not we've been following Jesus for a long time or we're not even sure what we believe about Jesus. The question, do I believe God's best for me is actually best for me? Do I believe that my sexuality is best experienced in God's design? Do I believe that my money is best enjoyed in God's boundaries? Do I believe that my power is best leveraged for God's purposes? And while we're going to jump into these conversations a bit more in depth over the ensuing weeks, today I want to just kind of serve as an introduction for us, really ask this question that maybe we've all asked in some way, shape, or form, which is this: why do we find ourselves frustrated when it comes to sex, money, and power? Maybe you've been frustrated in the past. Maybe you find yourself frustrated now. But I know part of the human experience is that we get frustrated with these things, right? Some of us right now are frustrated with our power. You're saying to yourself, I wish I had more power, and I wish my boss had less, right? Some of us feel that way. Others of us, it's about our money, right? I wish, this is the same refrain, I wish I had more, right? We would all say, I wish I had a little bit more money. And if you've got kids, you're saying, I wish they didn't cost so much, right? That's the reality. And some of us are frustrated with our sex life. I wish we had more, some of you say. And then your significant other said, I wish they'd want less. Like there's this frustration that we experience. It's interesting that the top three things that couples fight about are money, sex, and parenting, which is really a power dynamic. And maybe your first marriage ended because of one of these reasons. Or maybe as a kid, you experienced the collateral damage of a mother or a father who chose these pursuits over your family. And it really begs the question, why? Why is it that people are willing to sacrifice so much to pursue these things? It seems like the worst crimes and the most collateral damage in our lives involve the pursuit of sex, of money, and power. If it's a presidential impeachment or parents that are paying to bribe people to get their kids into college, or if it's just another spiritual leader who has succumbed to sexual temptation, it seems like our world is most desperate for and damaged by this pursuit of sex, money, and power. Why is that? Well, I think that there's an interesting reality that we've got to process as people, is that we've all grown up with a perspective about these particular things, and they've been shaped by our family, they've been shaped by our religious experience as well. And today, what I want to do is introduce to some of us, maybe for the first time, a perspective about sex, money, and power that maybe we haven't heard before in church, and maybe remind some of us who are still dealing with the realities of our childhood and the way that we've experienced these things about what God's best really is. So here's what I want you to know, and maybe even write it down in your notes, that sex, money, and power are not bad things. They are good gifts from God. which if I could sit down with each of you, we would say, that sounds great, but that is not what I heard growing up in my religious education, right? That is not the message that I necessarily heard from mom and dad. Maybe you've experienced some of these non-nuanced messages as you experienced your life growing up. One of these is money, right? Money is the root of all evil. You guys ever heard that before? Money is the root of all evil. So give it to the religious leaders. Some of us have been raised with that perspective. Power. Power corrupts people, so get as much of it as you can. Or my personal favorite growing up as a kid in 1990s youth group culture. Anybody else kind of have that 1990s youth group culture? This is kind of the message we heard over and over again into the early 2000s. Sex is shameful and gross. So save it for the one that you love, right? And all of these messages that we have grown up with put us in a position that we don't necessarily know how to manage these realities the older we get. And here's the problem with these very, very simplistic teachings that maybe we grew up with our religious education or maybe with our family of origin. The problem is this, that these half answers don't work in the real world. They're not true when we actually experience these things. But even more so, and more compelling, I think, is that the Bible tells us a different story about God and humanity. As you open up the pages of your Bible, whether or not you start in the first spot or if you go to the end, throughout the storyline of Scripture, what we find over and over and over again is that God's heart for sex, money, and power is so different than some of what we've been taught and what we internally believe. And so today, I want to reintroduce us to God's heart for you when it comes to sex, money, and power. And we'll start in the beginning of the story. In Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, the first 4 words that start every single Bible say this: in the beginning, God. And this is really important because if you're a follower of Jesus, we should get our perspective on who God is, what God is passionate about, and get our perspective on humanity, what he intended us to be like, and for what life should have been like. We should get our perspective from Genesis 1 and 2. This is called the Eden hermeneutic. Hermeneutic's just a fancy word to say the way that we interpret something. So the way that we should interpret God and the way that we should interpret our humanity is looking at Genesis 1 and 2, which is Moses' picture of what God intended for us to be like in the beginning. We find in the beginning God created, and over and over and over again there's a refrain. In the beginning God created, and when he created something he called it what? He called it good. Over and over again, good. And then in verses 27 and 28, we see that God creates the magnum opus, the great climax, the apex of his creativity in humanity. And we find that as God does this, he says some really powerful things about you and about me that I think are important in this conversation. In Genesis chapter 1, verse 27, we find this. So God created human beings in his own image. In his image, in the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. So important. It means that you are an image bearer of God. You reflect God. You reflect God. You reflect God. You reflect God. That when we think of all of creation, the thing that is closest to a reflection of God is not an aardvark. Aardvarks do not carry the image of God. It's not a dog. Dogs do not carry the image of God. And it's definitely not a cat. In fact, my personal opinion is that cats did not exist until after sin entered the world. That's my own perspective. And then, after we understand that we're actually created in the image of God, God gives us the creation mandate. He explains to us what we should be as people. And he says this: then God blessed them and said, and I'm going to ask you whenever there's a pink word here in this verse to say it out loud with me. Then God blessed them and said, be fruitful and multiply. Now stop here. That's sex. God created sex for our enjoyment, and he commanded us to have it. The next one is this: fill the earth and govern it. Now, you've got to stop here because there's a little nuance that's really helpful here. What God is saying is that the preferred end is that we would fulfill his command to procreate, that there be many human beings on the planet. And then as these human beings populate and live in little communities and little city centers and begin to develop resource, that there would be governments that would help manage the realities of what occurs. And with that government would come commerce and economy and money. Money's been a part of the story from the beginning. And then he says, reign. Another word there in another translation would be the word take dominion. That's power. Take dominion, reign over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky and all the animals that scurry along the ground. So see this. God created a good world to remind us of his goodness, where sex, money, and power were always a part of the plan. And beyond that, what's so cool about God is that God could have designed each of these things to be pleasureless, but he designed them to be pleasureful. God designed an intimate sexual experience to emote some kind of pleasure in us. God created a process for us to live out our gifts and talents and abilities as we build resources to elicit pleasure in us. And God gave us power as a way for us to see ourselves as different than the rest of what he created. When God made the world, he had your pleasure in mind. And it pleases God when you and I experience pleasure the way that he designed it. In fact, there's a really great book I'd recommend to you called Sex and Money by Paul Tripp. I was reading it this week. My daughter walked by, and she's like, Dad, what are you reading? And I said, it's a book. And she said, well, what's the name of the book? And I said, it's Sex and Money. And she looked at me, and then she looked at my wife, and she looked back to me, and she's like, that is weird. And then she just kept on walking. There's this great quote that Tripp has in there that I think really sums up how God's designed the world for your pleasure, and it pleases God to see you experience pleasure in his design. Look what Tripp says. He says, the pleasures of life are everywhere you turn. They greet you every day and all throughout the day. You couldn't escape pleasure if you tried. Do you know why? There's only one answer. Because God wanted it that way. With wisdom and purpose, he created a world that is stuffed to overflowing with pleasures of every kind. There are pleasures of sight and sound and taste and touch. There are pleasures of thought and emotion. Pleasure exists because it fits with God's purpose for his creation. And our ability to recognize and enjoy it is a result of his design. Which begs this question: where did it go wrong? If sex was intended to be pleasureful, why is sexual abuse so rampant in our day and age? If money was meant to be enjoyed and to derive pleasure, why do we live in a culture of corporate greed and exploitation? If power was meant to be something that helped connect us to God so we would understand we were made in his image, why is it that we live in a world where there are more slaves today than ever in the history of our world, and people are taken advantage of day after day? How did these good things become so corrupted? Where did it go wrong? Well, the answer to that question is given to us by Paul. Paul was a first century leader in the early church who did not start with the story loving Jesus. In fact, he started his journey hating Christians, overseeing their death because he saw them as a problem to deal with because of the potential of an insurrection in his mind. He was a man who did not believe in Christianity as a good thing for society. But then he has an encounter with Jesus that changes and transforms his life. And he leaves his station as a public leader. He leaves his financial resource. And he goes into cities throughout the Mediterranean rim, modern day places like Greece and Turkey. And he starts these little churches. And in our New Testament, we have letter after letter after letter written by Paul to these churches explaining to us God's heart and God's plan and God's purpose. And in one of those letters, in Romans, a letter that he writes to a church in Rome, he explains and diagnoses what went wrong with humanity. And this is what he says in verse 21 of Romans chapter 1. He said, yes, they knew God. Now stop. The they here is all of humanity. He's describing the human condition. That humanity knew God, meaning you can look at the world around you and clearly there is a designer. But they would not worship him as God or even give him thanks. And they began to think up foolish ideas of what God was like. And as a result, their minds became dark and confused. This is the human condition, is it not? Claiming to be wise, they became utter fools. And instead of worshiping the glorious, ever-living God, they worshiped, would you say this word with me on the count of three? 1, 2, 3. Idols, we'll talk about that later, to look like mere people and birds, animals, and reptiles. Here's what Paul is saying. We turned what was meant to be a window to see God into a mirror to worship ourselves. Sex was a window that God designed that as we experience that pleasure, we would see God and think, what an incredible God that he would design intimacy this way. Money would be a window that would allow us to say, what an incredible God that's given us the gifts and the abilities to create and to design this way. Our power would be a window for us to see God and say, what an incredible God who's designed us with the ability to govern and to lead. What a beautiful gift he's given us. But instead of having a window to see God, we've turned these things into mirrors to make it all about ourselves. So sex is now about me and what I can get out of it. And money is about me and how much I can consume and what neighborhood I can live in and how people think about me. And power is about how much I can leverage to get what I want so I can live the life that I think I deserve. And while that might seem a little bit aggressive, if you were to cut at the core of who all of us are, there's a little bit of that in every single one of us, isn't there? And Paul says that the issue in play is that whenever you place value, worship, on something that other than the Creator, you are worshiping an idol. And idolatry is simply this: when we choose to value creation instead of the Creator. And can we agree we do this all of the time? We stand at the precipice of the Grand Canyon and maybe we think about the glory of a God that could do something like that. Or maybe we enjoy a great meal and we don't pause for a second to think about all of the different ingredients that it takes to make something this spectacular. And we think, oh, this steak is great, but we don't think about the one who created a world and a universe in which cows can exist and then be murdered for our benefit, right? We don't think about those things. We do this all the time. An idol is simply this. An idol is any created thing that becomes an ultimate thing. And let me tell you, in our lives, they are powerful. They're little g gods that we put on the altar of our hearts that blind us to the big G God who's given us so much. Tim Keller puts it this way in his book, Counterfeit Gods. He says, an idol can lead you to break any promise, rationalize any indiscretion, or betray any other allegiance in order to hold on to it. It may drive you to violate all good and proper boundaries. To practice idolatry is to become a slave. And we know people like this, don't we? Maybe you've experienced the collateral damage of people that became worshipers of idols. A father who couldn't get over his addiction, and so because of that, the family came to ruins. A friend who was so focused on their career and their work, you saw that their relationships just shrivel into nothingness. A person who pursued thing after thing after thing, sexual experience after sexual experience after sexual experience, only to hurt and wound the people around them. This is what happens because an idol promises us everything, demands everything from us, and then leaves us with nothing to show for it in the end. But here's what I want you to know. That sex, money, and power are not our cultural idols. That you may not have a sex problem, and you may not have a money problem, and you may not have a power problem. You're like, oh, no, that's the problem. Well, maybe it's not. I would submit to you this, that sex, money, and power are the tools we're told will get us what we really desire. That underneath those things, there's a deeper longing in our soul. And if we were to just pause for a moment, we'd be able to see what it actually is. Because every culture has its idols, and all you need to figure them out is to pay attention to what's being advertised to us. Last year, $290 billion were spent by advertising agencies and companies to convince you that your life is terrible and you need their product to have a good one. And then we bought the stuff, didn't we? Now, if you're in the advertising and marketing business, I think it's a valuable work. I think storytelling and helping people understand how particular products can be useful for them is of utmost importance, and it's vital. But I think what's so interesting is when you evaluate, and watch Super Bowl commercials tonight, when you evaluate the storyline of what the commercial is actually talking about, sometimes it's not connected to the product. You ever been there before? You ever watched a commercial and be like, I don't know how that relates to that at all, right? You thought that before? How many of you guys remember the Old Spice Man? Anybody remember the Old Spice Man? I've got a picture to remind you of him if you forgot. Yeah, the Old Spice Man, the man that when he showed up on a commercial, every husband kind of looked over to their wife and was like, I'm so sorry, I'll never be that, right? That guy, right? I want to read to you one of the kind of excerpts from the Old Spice Man commercial. These commercials that went viral. Actually, one particular commercial I'm about to read to you has 58 million views on YouTube, and it was 10 years ago, which begs the question, what sad soul is going to look at this man 10 years later, right? But this is what the commercial says. Remember, maybe you'll remember this. Hello, ladies. Look at your man. Now back to me. Now back at your man. Now back to me. Don't do that now, that would be weird. Sadly, he isn't me. But if he stopped using lady-scented body wash and switched to Old Spice, he could smell like he's me. Look down, back up. Where are you? You're on a boat with a man your man could smell like. What's in your hand? Back at me. I have it. It's an oyster with 2 tickets to that thing you love. Look again, the tickets are now diamonds. Anything is possible when your man smells like Old Spice and not a lady. I'm on a boat. You guys remember this commercial? Now, here's the thing. It's body wash. And it's a man shirtless with a six-pack that none of us will ever have, right? And the question is, what was the science behind this? Well, marketers at Old Spice did some research, and what they found was that the people who purchase body wash, as a general rule, are always women. And their tendency was to just purchase body wash for them that their significant other would use, right? That seems like a pretty normal deal. But what they began to realize is if we want to break into the male body wash environment, we need to stop trying to promote this to the guys because the guys don't care what they smell like, right? Some guys are like, it's been 5 days and I haven't taken a shower. Oh, I should probably do something about that, right? Like that's kind of that world, right? So what they found was this, is that they could not get men to buy body wash, but if they could get the significant others to buy body wash for them, they would be able to open up a new market. But hear me, they're not selling sex in this ad with a man whose shirt is off in a small, scanty towel. That's not what they're selling. What they're selling is the idea that women, you can control the outcome of your relational connection with your man if you just buy this body wash. He's never going to look like me. I know you married him and he used to, and now he's put on a couple LBs and they're not going away. So what you can do instead is purchase this body wash and it will give you a sense of control in your relationship. See, the ad wasn't about sex. The ad was about something deeper in all of our hearts. You see, there are actual idols that our hearts desire that are far more important to us than sex, money, and power. And we can identify those idols with a simple diagnostic using the if-then statement. Our idols are identified in our if-then internal conversations. You know those conversations you have in your mind that nobody else has with you, but that you have when nobody else is around? The question that you're really asking is, what do you really want? Keller puts it this way: an idol is whatever you look at and say in your heart of hearts, if I have that, then I'll feel like my life has meaning. Then I'll know I have value. Then I'll feel significant and secure. The if-then statement. What are the ifs in your life that you think, if I had that, then everything else would be okay? I would submit to you that at the core of all of us, there are 3 deep longings in our soul. The first one is comfort. And for many of us, it looks like this: if I had, fill in the blank, then I would be happy and stress-free. The second idol of our heart is approval. If I had, fill in the blank, then I would be accepted and included. And control. Who doesn't want control? If I had, fill in the blank, then I could determine the outcome. And sex, money, and power are simply the tools we're sold that tell us that if we have enough of those things, then we'll have what we need. It looks a little bit like this. When it comes to approval, if I have a sexual partner, then I won't need to feel this pain anymore. When it comes to approval, if I have sex with my significant other, then he or she won't leave me for someone better. Or when it comes to control, if I withhold sex from my spouse, then he or she will do what I want them to do. Probably not working out for you, but that's what we think, right? When it comes to money, comfort, if I have enough money, then we won't feel any more financial pressure. But you've got more money than you've ever had, and you still feel financial pressure. Approval. If I wear these brand names, live in this neighborhood, then I'll finally feel like we've made it and we'll be accepted. And so we buy a lot of things with money we do not have to impress people we do not like, to chase the sense of acceptance that will never come. Control. If we can afford to live in this school district, I can control how my kids will turn out. And so, control looks like if I could just get them in the right public school, everything will be okay. Maybe we should homeschool them. Everything will be okay. I can control the outcomes of the kids. Or maybe if I send them to private school, everything will be okay. And what we all know to be true is that if you send your kids to public school, some of them are going to turn out a little crazy, right? And if you send your kids to private school, some of them are going to turn out a little bit crazy. If you homeschool your kids, some of them are going to turn out a little bit crazy. And the only difference between the three is that if you homeschooled your kids and they turn out crazy, that's on you. But we've been sold the lie that the solution to our desire for comfort, approval, and control is found in the right mix of sex, money, and power. And it's not. Because the comfort your heart longs for can only be found in a personal relationship with Jesus. And the approval that your heart longs for can only be found when you realize your heavenly Father accepts you as you are and loves you anyway. And the control that we're all grasping for in life we'll never experience until we surrender that control to the one who's ultimately in control of our lives. And everything else is a vain chasing after the wind. And here's what's at stake. What's at stake, especially if you're a follower of Jesus, is this. Is that if we're not careful, we'll let our idols, these little things in our hearts, determine what kind of Jesus we follow. And we may end up not following Jesus at all. Because if the Jesus you're following allows you to hold on to a little bit of your comfort, then you're not following Jesus. And if the Jesus you're following allows you to hold on to a little bit of that approval and acceptance you can get in other ways by being a workaholic or looking a certain way, you're probably not following Jesus. And if your Jesus that you're following allows you to maintain a degree of control and you never actually really surrender, you may not be following Jesus. You're following a version of Jesus that ultimately will lead you to a place you never wanted to be. But when we take the invitation of Jesus seriously, to say my comfort is only found in being known by you, and my approval is only found in being loved by you, and my control is only meant to be experienced under yours, when we find what our heart is longing for. And so today really serves as an introduction. We're going to talk about how sex and money and power influence us and maybe even lie to us about these things over the next couple of weeks. But the question I want to leave you with is this. Do you believe God's best for you is actually what's best for you, even if it means letting go of your idol? And the good news is you can trust God's best for you is best for you because he's already proved his love for you. That Jesus lived a perfect life, died a painful death, and then defeated death on our behalf to be a raging, clear, bright sign in the dark sky, letting you know his love is for you, and you can trust him. So today, I want to invite you to take a couple of next steps as we jump into a conversation that I think could change your life. Here's your next step for this week. The first one is this: watch the Super Bowl. How cool of a church are you at that that's a next step, right? Watch the Super Bowl. But tonight, I want you to watch the Super Bowl with a different lens. I want you to watch those Super Bowl commercials and ask yourself the question, what are they really selling me? Is it comfort? Is it approval? Is it control? And recognize we swim in an ocean that tells us that those things can be found somewhere else other than the one who designed us to find them in him. Secondly, download the podcast. Every now and then, we have a podcast that we provide as a way to have a deeper conversation about what we talk about on Sunday called Beyond 30. And later on this week, some of our leadership team will sit down and have a deeper conversation about what we just talked about. And make sure you download that podcast later in the week, wherever podcasts are found, and lean into the conversation that we have together. Thirdly, discuss this in your group. Ask yourself this question in group this week. Is it control? Is it approval? Is it comfort? And maybe you might find yourself saying, I am the Holy Trinity of three, all of them, control, approval, and comfort. Those are all three that I am longing for. But have that conversation. And lastly, your next step is to come back next week. Because next week, we're going to talk about your sex life. And if you have a teenager, they should be on the first 2 rows. It is a can't miss message with a can't miss application that might just change your life and the life of the people you love. Next week, we'll talk about the purpose of sex and the path to freedom. Would you stand with me as we pray?